The morning sun cast long shadows across the Texas frontier as Sarah Mitchell hung freshly washed clothes on the line behind her small wooden cabin. At 23, she had already endured more hardship than most women twice her age. Her husband James had been killed in an Apache raid just 6 months earlier, leaving her to care for their 2 young children and manage their small farm alone. The year was 1871, and the Apache Wars were reaching their most violent peak across the American Southwest. Sarah's nearest neighbor lived 5 miles away, and the closest military fort was a 2-day ride through dangerous territory. Like many frontier women, she had learned to shoot a rifle and keep watch for signs of trouble. The Apache had been pushed from their traditional lands by the encroaching settlements, and their resistance had grown increasingly fierce and desperate. What had begun as isolated conflicts had evolved into a brutal cycle of raids, revenge, and retaliation that would claim thousands of lives over the following decades. On this particular morning, Sarah noticed her chickens acting strangely, clucking and fluttering with unusual agitation. Her 6-year-old daughter Emma was playing with corn husk dolls near the cabin, while 4-year-old Thomas helped his mother by carrying small items back to the house. The children had grown up knowing they must always stay close to home and never wander beyond the fence line that marked their property. Their mother had taught them to recognize the sound of approaching horses and to run immediately to the root cellar if they heard anything suspicious. Miles away, a band of Chiricahua Apache warriors led by a young chief named Naiche moved silently through the desert landscape. They had been tracking a group of soldiers for 3 days, but the military patrol had proven elusive. Their supplies were running low, and several members of their band were wounded from a previous encounter with settlers. The traditional Apache way of life was disappearing as their hunting grounds were claimed by ranchers, and their water sources were controlled by the U.S. military. Desperation drove them to increasingly bold raids on isolated homesteads. These Apache warriors were not mindless savages, as they were often portrayed in newspaper accounts of the time. They were fighting for their survival and the preservation of their ancient culture. Many had families of their own hidden in remote mountain strongholds, and they understood the value of women and children in maintaining their tribal community. The Apache had a complex social structure where women held important roles as keepers of tradition, healers, and decision-makers in many aspects of daily life. Sarah's peaceful morning routine was shattered when she spotted dust clouds on the horizon moving in her direction. Her heart began racing as she quickly gathered her children and rushed them toward the cabin. She had practiced this moment countless times in her mind, but the reality was far more terrifying than she had imagined. The approaching riders moved with purpose and speed, and she knew immediately that these were not friendly visitors or passing travelers. As the Apache warriors drew closer, Sarah could see their painted faces and the weapons they carried. She managed to get her children inside the cabin and barricaded the door with furniture, but she knew their simple wooden walls would provide little protection against determined attackers. Through a crack in the shutters, she watched as the warriors surrounded her home, cutting off any possibility of escape. Their leader, Naiche, dismounted and approached the cabin with several of his men. The Apache had developed sophisticated tactics for dealing with fortified positions, having learned from decades of warfare with both Mexican and American forces. They knew how to use fire, how to create distractions, and how to force their enemies into impossible choices. Naiche called out in broken English, demanding that the family surrender. He had no desire to harm women and children unnecessarily, but he also understood that taking captives could provide his band with valuable bargaining power in future negotiations with the military. Sarah clutched her children close as smoke began seeping through the walls of their cabin. The Apache had set fire to the outbuildings and were now threatening to burn the main house. She faced an impossible decision that thousands of frontier women would confront during the Apache Wars. She could fight and likely watch her children die in the flames, or she could surrender and hope for mercy from warriors who had every reason to hate white settlers. The sound of crackling flames and her children's frightened whimpers filled the smoky cabin as Sarah made the most difficult choice of her life. She slowly opened the door and stepped outside with Emma and Thomas, raising her hands to show she was unarmed. The warriors quickly surrounded them, and Naiche studied the family with calculating eyes. He saw a young mother trying to protect her children, much like the Apache women, who had been killed or displaced by American soldiers and settlers. What happened next would set in motion a chain of events that would forever change the lives of this frontier family and countless others like them. The capture of women and children during the Apache Wars was not simply a matter of random violence, but part of a complex web of cultural misunderstanding, desperate survival, and the tragic collision of two very different ways of life. For Sarah Mitchell and her children, this moment marked the beginning of an ordeal that would test every aspect of their humanity and resilience. The Apache Wars represented one of the longest and most brutal conflicts in American history, lasting from the 1840s until the final surrender of Geronimo in 1886. During this period, hundreds of women and children from both cultures would experience capture, separation from their families, and forced adaptation to entirely foreign ways of life. Their stories reveal the true human cost of westward expansion and the devastating impact of cultural warfare on innocent civilians caught in the middle of forces beyond their control. Sarah's hands trembled as she held her children close while the Apache warriors bound their wrists with strips of rawhide. The smoke from their burning cabin filled the air with an acrid smell that would haunt her memories for years to come. Emma buried her face against her mother's shoulder, while young Thomas stared wide-eyed at the painted faces surrounding them. The warriors moved with practiced efficiency, loading supplies from the cabin onto their horses and preparing for a rapid departure from the area. Nietzsche spoke quietly with his men in the Apache language, gesturing toward the captives and pointing in different directions. Sarah could not understand their words, but she sensed they were debating what to do with their prisoners. Some of the younger warriors appeared eager to continue their raid on other nearby settlements, while older members of the band seemed more cautious about the potential consequences of taking white captives. The decision would ultimately rest with their leader, who carried the weight of his people's survival on his shoulders. The journey began immediately, with Sarah and her children forced to walk alongside the Apache horses as they headed southwest toward the mountainous desert regions that served as the tribe's stronghold. The terrain was harsh and unforgiving, with rocky ground that cut through the thin soles of their shoes and thorny vegetation that tore at their clothing. Sarah had never traveled more than a few miles from her homestead, and the vast emptiness of the landscape filled her with despair about ever finding her way back to civilization. As they traveled, Sarah began to observe the Apache warriors more closely. Trying to understand their motivations and behavior, she noticed that they moved through the desert with an intimate knowledge of every water source, every sheltered camping spot, and every potential danger. These men were not the bloodthirsty savages described in newspaper accounts, but skilled survivors who had adapted to one of the harshest environments on the continent. Their clothing was practical and well-made, their weapons were carefully maintained, and their horses showed signs of excellent care. The first night of captivity was perhaps the most terrifying experience of Sarah's life. The Apache made camp in a hidden canyon where they could build a small fire without being detected by pursuing soldiers. Sarah and her children were given a small portion of dried meat and water, but they were too frightened and exhausted to eat much. The children clung to their mother as strange sounds echoed through the darkness around them. Coyotes howled in the distance, and the unfamiliar calls of desert birds added to their sense of being in an alien world. During the long hours of that first night, Sarah reflected on the stories she had heard about other women who had been captured by Apache raiders. Some had been rescued after weeks or months of captivity, while others had simply vanished forever into the vast wilderness. A few had eventually returned to white society, but they were often changed beyond recognition by their experiences. The uncertainty of not knowing what fate awaited her and her children was almost unbearable. The Apache warriors took turns standing guard throughout the night, constantly watching for signs of pursuit. They knew that the smoke from the burning cabin would eventually attract the attention of soldiers or other settlers, and a rescue party would likely be organized within days. Speed and stealth were essential for reaching the safety of their mountain hideouts before being overtaken by better armed cavalry units. Every hour of delay increased the risk of a confrontation that could result in the deaths of captives and captors alike. As dawn broke over the desert, the band resumed their march toward Apache territory. Sarah noticed that the warriors were becoming more relaxed as they moved farther from white settlements and deeper into lands they knew intimately. They began speaking more freely among themselves, and occasionally one of them would point out landmarks or wildlife to his companions. She realized that for these men, they were not traveling through enemy territory but returning home to familiar ground where they held every advantage. On the second day of the journey, Sarah witnessed something that challenged her preconceptions about Apache culture. When young Thomas stumbled and fell, scraping his knee on a sharp rock, one of the warriors immediately dismounted and examined the injury. Using a mixture of plants and water, he created a healing paste and carefully applied it to the child's wound while speaking softly in Apache. The gentleness of this gesture surprised Sarah, who had expected only cruelty from their captors. The treatment of women and children among the Apache was governed by complex cultural traditions that white settlers rarely understood. In Apache society, women held important positions as healers, storytellers, and spiritual leaders. Children were considered precious gifts who represented the future of the tribe. While the warriors might show no mercy to armed enemies, they were raised to protect and care for those who could not defend themselves. This cultural conditioning influenced how they treated their captives, even during the bitter conflicts of the Apache Wars. As they traveled deeper into Apache territory, Sarah began to notice changes in the landscape and climate. The desert gave way to higher elevations with pine forests and mountain meadows. The air became cooler and thinner, and she could see snow-capped peaks in the distance. This was a beautiful but forbidding land that seemed to exist in a different world from the familiar plains and farmlands of her former home. She wondered if she would ever see Texas again, or if her children would grow up in this remote wilderness, among people whose language and customs were completely foreign to them. The psychological impact of captivity was beginning to take its toll on the small family. Emma had not spoken since leaving their burning cabin, communicating only through gestures and clinging desperately to her mother. Thomas alternated between periods of curiosity about their captors and episodes of inconsolable crying for his dead father. Sarah struggled to maintain her composure and provide comfort to her children while dealing with her own fears about their uncertain future. She knew that survival might depend on adapting to Apache ways, but the thought of abandoning her own culture and identity was almost as terrifying as the prospect of death. After 5 grueling days of travel through increasingly remote mountain terrain, Sarah and her children finally reached the Apache stronghold that would become their new home. The settlement was hidden in a natural bowl surrounded by towering cliffs, accessible only through narrow passages that could easily be defended against intruders. As they descended into the valley, Sarah was struck by how different this community was from the violent war party that had captured them. She saw women tending cooking fires, children playing games, and elders sitting in the shade of carefully constructed shelters. The arrival of captives created a stir of excitement and curiosity among the Apache residents. Women emerged from their dwellings to examine the newcomers, while children gathered at a respectful distance to stare at the pale-skinned strangers. Sarah felt like an exotic animal being displayed for the entertainment of others, but she also sensed an underlying compassion in many of the faces that surrounded them. Several Apache women approached her with obvious concern, speaking in gentle tones and making gestures that seemed to offer comfort despite the language barrier. An elderly Apache woman named Ishke stepped forward from the crowd and took charge of the situation. She had gray hair streaked with silver, and deep lines around her eyes that spoke of decades of wisdom and experience. Without hesitation, she guided Sarah and her children toward a shelter at the edge of the settlement, away from the curious crowds. Her movements were purposeful and kind, suggesting that she had dealt with captives before and understood their need for privacy and security during this traumatic transition. The shelter that would serve as their new home was a traditional Apache wickiup, constructed from wooden poles covered with brush and animal hides. It was much smaller than their Texas cabin, but surprisingly comfortable and well-suited to the mountain climate. Ishke provided them with clean water, simple clothing more appropriate for desert life, and a meal of corn cakes and meat stew. She spoke no English, but her actions conveyed a maternal concern that transcended language barriers. During their first week in the Apache settlement, Sarah began to understand the complex social structure that governed daily life in this remote community. The Apache lived in extended family groups with decisions made collectively by councils of elders and respected warriors. Women held significant influence in many aspects of tribal governance, particularly in matters related to children, healing, and spiritual practices. This was very different from the male-dominated society that Sarah had known in white settlements, where women had few legal rights and limited opportunities for leadership. Ishke became Sarah's primary teacher and protector, during these early days of captivity. Through gestures, drawings in the dirt, and simple demonstrations, she began teaching Sarah essential Apache customs and survival skills. She showed her how to gather edible plants, how to prepare traditional foods, and how to repair the wickiup when mountain winds damaged its covering. These lessons were not merely practical instructions but cultural education that would be essential for survival in Apache society. The Apache children in the settlement were naturally curious about Emma and Thomas, despite the obvious language barriers that separated them. Gradually, tentative friendships began to develop through shared games and activities that required no words. Thomas was particularly drawn to the Apache boys who taught him how to make small bows and arrows and showed him how to track animals through the mountain forests. Emma remained more withdrawn, but she began watching the Apache girls as they helped their mothers with daily tasks and participated in traditional ceremonies. As weeks passed, Sarah realized that their captivity was not temporary imprisonment, but a form of adoption into Apache society. The warriors who had captured them had not intended to use them as bargaining chips or slaves, but rather to replace tribal members who had been killed in recent conflicts with white settlers and soldiers. This practice of replacing the dead with captives was an ancient Apache tradition that helped maintain tribal population and cultural continuity during times of war and displacement. The psychological adaptation required for this new life was enormous and often overwhelming. Sarah struggled with guilt about surviving when her husband had been killed, anger at being forced to abandon her former life, and fear about what the future held for her children. She worried that Emma and Thomas would gradually forget their father and their white heritage as they became integrated into Apache culture. At the same time, she recognized that acceptance and adaptation might be their only hope for long-term survival in this harsh environment. Religious and spiritual practices played a central role in Apache daily life, and Sarah found herself gradually exposed to beliefs and rituals that were completely foreign to her Christian upbringing. The Apache viewed the natural world as sacred, with every mountain, stream, and living creature possessing spiritual significance. Their ceremonies involved complex songs, dances, and symbolic actions designed to maintain harmony between the human and natural worlds. While Sarah could not fully understand or accept these beliefs, she began to appreciate their beauty and the sense of community they created among tribal members. The Apache had their own complex moral code that governed behavior within the tribe and toward outsiders. Generosity, courage, and loyalty were highly valued, while selfishness, cowardice, and betrayal were severely condemned. Children were raised with great affection, but also with clear expectations about their responsibilities to the community. Sarah observed that Apache parents rarely used physical punishment, instead relying on storytelling, example, and social pressure to teach proper behavior. This approach was markedly different from the harsh disciplinary methods common in white frontier communities. As autumn approached and the mountain air grew colder, Sarah faced the sobering realization that she and her children would likely spend the winter in the Apache settlement. The mountain passes would soon become impassable due to snow, making any rescue attempt virtually impossible until spring. This forced her to confront the possibility that their captivity might last for months or even years, fundamentally changing their identities and their understanding of themselves. The woman who had once hung laundry behind a Texas cabin was slowly disappearing, replaced by someone who was learning to survive in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. The emotional toll of this transformation was immense, but Sarah also began to recognize unexpected aspects of Apache life that offered hope and even occasional moments of joy. The strong sense of community support, the deep connection to the natural world, and the resilience of people who had survived generations of hardship provided lessons that would serve her well in the difficult years ahead. Winter descended upon the Apache stronghold with a ferocity that Sarah had never experienced in the lower elevations of Texas. Snow piled deep around their wickiup, and icy winds howled through the mountain passes day and night. The extreme weather conditions created a sense of isolation that was both terrifying and strangely comforting, as Sarah knew that if she and her children could not leave this place, neither could soldiers or settlers who might wish them harm. The Apache had chosen their winter camp well, in a sheltered valley with natural windbreaks and access to underground springs that provided fresh water, even when surface streams froze solid. During the long winter months, Sarah's education in Apache ways intensified out of necessity. Ishkay taught her how to tan hides properly, how to weave baskets from mountain grasses, and how to preserve meat using traditional smoking techniques. These skills were not merely helpful additions to her knowledge, but essential survival abilities that could mean the difference between life and death in the harsh mountain environment. Sarah discovered that she had a natural aptitude for many of these tasks, and her competence gradually earned her respect from other Apache women in the settlement. Emma and Thomas adapted to their new life with the remarkable resilience that children often display in difficult circumstances. By midwinter, both children were speaking basic Apache phrases and had formed genuine friendships with tribal children of similar ages. Thomas became particularly close to a boy named Chato, who was only slightly older, but had already begun learning the skills of hunting and warfare that Apache boys were expected to master. Emma found comfort in helping with food preparation and childcare, activities that gave her a sense of purpose and belonging in the community. The Apache approach to education and child-rearing fascinated Sarah as she observed how tribal children learned essential life skills. Rather than formal instruction, learning happened through observation, imitation, and gradual participation in adult activities. Children were encouraged to ask questions and experiment with different approaches to problem solving. This method produced young people who were remarkably self-reliant and confident in their abilities to survive in challenging conditions. Sarah began to wonder whether her own children might actually benefit from this type of upbringing, despite the tragic circumstances that had brought them to this place. As winter progressed, Sarah learned more about the personal histories of the Apache people who had become her reluctant hosts. Many of them had lost family members to violence perpetrated by white settlers and soldiers, just as she had lost her husband to Apache raiders. The cycle of revenge and retaliation had claimed victims on both sides, creating a web of grief and anger that seemed impossible to break. She began to understand that the warriors who had captured her family were not motivated by simple cruelty but by their own experiences of loss and their desperate need to protect what remained of their traditional way of life. Ishkay gradually shared her own story through a combination of simple English words, gestures, and drawings. She had been married to a respected warrior who was killed during a cavalry attack on their previous camp 3 years earlier. Her 2 adult sons had died in separate conflicts with white settlers, leaving her without immediate family in a culture where family relationships were the foundation of social identity. Taking responsibility for Sarah and her children had given Ishkay a renewed sense of purpose and helped fill the emotional void left by her own losses. The winter months also brought Sarah into closer contact with Apache spiritual practices and beliefs. She witnessed healing ceremonies for sick tribal members, coming-of-age rituals for young people, and sacred dances designed to ensure the return of spring and the renewal of life. While she could not abandon her Christian faith, she began to appreciate the deep connection to nature that characterized Apache spirituality. These beliefs provided comfort and meaning to people who lived in constant uncertainty, and Sarah found herself drawing strength from their emphasis on resilience and adaptation. Food became increasingly scarce as winter dragged on, and the entire community was forced to rely on carefully preserved supplies and whatever game the hunters could find in the snow-covered mountains. Sarah learned to stretch every bit of nutrition from their limited resources, making stews from dried meat, pine nuts, and wild roots that had been gathered during the warmer months. The experience of genuine hunger was something she had never faced before, and it gave her a new appreciation for the challenges that Apache people faced every day of their lives. Despite the harsh conditions and constant uncertainty about their future, moments of genuine happiness occasionally emerged during that long winter. Sarah would sometimes catch herself laughing at the antics of Apache children, or feeling moved by the beauty of snow-covered peaks gleaming in the morning sun. These experiences created a confusing mixture of emotions as she struggled with guilt about finding any joy in her current situation, while still grieving for her lost home and deceased husband. The complexity of human emotions in extreme circumstances was something no amount of frontier experience could have prepared her for. As spring approached, and the snow began to melt in the lower elevations, rumors reached the Apache settlement about increased military activity in the region. General George Crook had been assigned to lead a major campaign against the Apache, and his forces were reportedly planning a systematic effort to locate and destroy all tribal strongholds. This news created tension and anxiety among the tribal members, who knew that their peaceful winter isolation was about to end. Decisions would need to be made about whether to move to an even more remote location, attempt to negotiate with the military, or prepare for armed resistance. For Sarah, the approaching spring meant confronting questions about her identity and loyalty that had been dormant during the winter months. She had learned to survive and even find moments of contentment in Apache society, but she remained fundamentally an outsider who might never be fully accepted or trusted. Her children were becoming increasingly integrated into tribal life, and she worried about their ability to readjust to white society if the opportunity for rescue ever arose. The prospect of leaving the Apache community now filled her with unexpected sadness, but she also longed for the familiar world she had lost. The transformation that had occurred during the winter months was profound and irreversible. Sarah was no longer simply a captive waiting for rescue, but a woman who had learned to navigate between two very different cultures. Her children had acquired skills and perspectives that would serve them well regardless of where their future lay. But they had also absorbed values and beliefs that might make their reintegration into white society difficult or impossible. The approaching spring would bring new challenges and choices that would determine the ultimate direction of their lives. The arrival of spring in 1872 brought both hope and terror to the Apache settlement where Sarah and her children had spent the long winter months. As the mountain snow melted and the passes became navigable again, scouts reported increasing military activity throughout the region. General George Crook's forces were methodically searching every canyon and valley, determined to locate and destroy the remaining Apache strongholds. The peaceful isolation that had protected the community during winter was rapidly disappearing, and tribal leaders faced agonizing decisions about how to protect their people from the approaching threat. Nietzsche called a council meeting that would determine the fate of everyone in the settlement, including the white captives who had become integrated into tribal life over the past months. Sarah was not permitted to attend this gathering, but she could hear the passionate debates that continued far into the night. Some voices advocated for immediate flight to even more remote mountain locations, while others argued for attempting to negotiate with the military authorities. A few of the younger warriors favored making a stand and fighting to defend their homeland, despite being vastly outnumbered and outgunned by the approaching soldiers. During these tense deliberations, Sarah found herself in an unexpected position of influence within the Apache community. Several tribal members approached her seeking information about military tactics, soldier behavior, and potential negotiation strategies. They recognized that her knowledge of white culture and language could be valuable in planning their response to the crisis. Sarah struggled with the moral implications of providing advice that might help the Apache evade capture or resist military forces, knowing that such assistance could be viewed as treason by her own people. Ishkane confided to Sarah that the tribal council was seriously considering sending the white captives back to military authorities as a gesture of goodwill that might lead to peaceful negotiations. This possibility filled Sarah with conflicting emotions she had not anticipated. After months of adaptation and survival in Apache society, the prospect of returning to white civilization was both desperately desired and strangely frightening. She had changed in fundamental ways that might make reintegration into her former life difficult or impossible, and she worried about how Emma and Thomas would cope with another dramatic upheaval in their young lives. The children's reactions to the possibility of leaving the Apache settlement revealed how completely they had adapted to their new environment. Thomas had formed such close bonds with his Apache friends that the thought of separation brought him to tears. He had learned to speak the Apache language fluently and had absorbed many of their cultural values and beliefs. Emma remained more reserved but had clearly found comfort and security in the structured daily routines of tribal life. Both children had difficulty remembering details about their previous life in Texas, and Sarah realized that for them, the Apache settlement had become their true home. As military pressure intensified, the Apache community began preparing for what might be their final departure from this stronghold. Women and children packed essential belongings onto horses and pack animals, while warriors cached weapons and supplies in hidden locations throughout the mountains. The atmosphere was charged with nervous energy and suppressed grief, as everyone understood they might never see this place again. For many tribal members, this valley represented the last refuge, where they could live according to traditional Apache ways without constant interference from white settlers and soldiers. Scout reports indicated that General Crook's forces were employing Apache guides and trackers who had agreed to work with the military in exchange for better treatment of their own families. This betrayal by fellow Apache created deep bitterness and division within the community, as traditional bonds of tribal loyalty were strained by the desperate circumstances of war. Sarah observed that the psychological warfare being waged against the Apache was often more devastating than direct military confrontation, as it undermined the social cohesion that had allowed them to survive centuries of challenges. One morning in early May, the distant sound of gunfire echoed through the mountain valleys, indicating that military forces had finally located and engaged Apache positions somewhere in the region. The settlement erupted into controlled chaos as families hastily completed their preparations for evacuation. Sarah found herself automatically helping with the packing and organization, her actions driven by months of conditioning and genuine concern for the welfare of people who had become her community despite the circumstances of her arrival. The decision was made to split the tribal group into smaller bands that would travel different routes through the mountains, making it more difficult for soldiers to track and corner them. Sarah and her children were assigned to travel with Ishkene's group, which would attempt to reach a remote canyon system where they might find temporary safety. As they prepared to leave the only home her children had known for nearly a year, Sarah struggled with the realization that their captivity had evolved into something far more complex than simple imprisonment. The evacuation began before dawn on a cold mountain morning, with the various groups departing at different times and heading in different directions. Sarah carried Emma on her back while Thomas walked beside her, both children showing remarkable maturity and courage in the face of another traumatic displacement. The Apache had taught them well about survival and adaptation, skills that would serve them regardless of what the future might bring. As they climbed through rocky terrain toward an uncertain destination, Sarah reflected on how completely her life had been transformed by the events of the past year. The sound of pursuing cavalry grew closer throughout the day, forcing the fleeing Apache to maintain a brutal pace through increasingly difficult terrain. Several elderly tribal members began falling behind, and the heartbreaking decision was made to leave them with minimal supplies and hope they could find places to hide until the immediate danger passed. These sacrifices illustrated the desperate circumstances that had driven the Apache to capture white families in the first place, as they struggled to maintain their communities while facing systematic destruction of their traditional way of life. As evening approached, the small band reached a narrow canyon where they hoped to rest and plan their next moves. But the temporary respite was shattered when scouts reported that military forces had surrounded the area and were demanding unconditional surrender. Trapped between towering rock walls with no possibility of escape, the Apache faced the end of their resistance and the beginning of a new chapter in their tragic history. For Sarah and her children, this moment represented another dramatic turning point that would once again reshape their identities and their understanding of where they belonged, in a world torn apart by cultural conflict and misunderstanding. The canyon walls echoed with the sound of cavalry horses and shouted commands as General Crook's forces established their positions around the trapped Apache band. Sarah clutched her children close as she watched the warriors prepare for what they knew would be their final stand as free people. The soldiers maintained their distance, apparently hoping to avoid bloodshed by forcing a surrender through negotiation rather than direct assault. Through the tense hours of standoff, Sarah found herself caught between two worlds, no longer fully belonging to either, but deeply concerned about the fate of people on both sides of the conflict. Major William Burke, General Crook's senior negotiator, called out in Spanish and broken Apache, demanding that the tribal members lay down their weapons and release any white captives in their possession. His voice carried across the rocky canyon with an authority that reflected years of military experience. But Sarah could detect an underlying weariness that suggested he had participated in too many similar confrontations. The Major's reputation for fair dealing with Apache prisoners had preceded him, offering some hope that the surrender might be handled with dignity rather than brutality. Naiche emerged from behind the rocks where his people had taken cover and walked slowly toward the center of the canyon floor. His bearing remained proud and defiant, despite the hopelessness of their situation, and Sarah felt a surge of admiration for the young chief who had tried so hard to protect his people's freedom. In a mixture of English and Spanish, He began negotiating the terms of surrender, insisting that his warriors be treated as prisoners of war, rather than common criminals, and that the women and children be permitted to remain with their families during transportation to the reservation. The negotiations continued for several hours, with both sides seeking to salvage some measure of dignity from this tragic conclusion to years of warfare. Sarah realized that she was witnessing a historic moment, the effective end of Apache resistance in this region, and the forced transition of an entire people from their traditional way of life to dependency on government authority. The weight of this transformation was visible in the faces of every tribal member, from the eldest warriors who remembered decades of freedom to the children who had known only conflict and displacement. When Major Burke demanded that all white captives be released immediately, Sarah faced a moment of truth that she had dreaded since learning of the military's approach. Ishkay gently guided her and the children toward the center of the canyon, but Sarah could see the pain in the elderly woman's eyes as she prepared to lose the surrogate family that had given her life meaning during the difficult winter months. Emma began crying and refused to let go of Ishkay's hand, while Thomas looked around in confusion at the adults, whose emotions he could sense, but not fully understand. The reunion between Sarah and the military forces was far less joyful than she had once imagined it would be. The soldiers who approached them were professional and courteous, but they clearly viewed her with suspicion and curiosity, rather than simple relief at her rescue. Captain James Morrison, who had been assigned to handle the captive recovery, asked pointed questions about her treatment, her activities during captivity, and her willingness to testify about Apache military capabilities. Sarah quickly realized that her year among the Apache had made her an object of interest rather than simply a victim to be comforted. The physical separation from the Apache community was traumatic for both Sarah's family and their former captors. As the children were loaded onto military wagons for transport to the nearest fort, they could hear the wailing of Apache women who had grown to love them as their own family members. Thomas broke free from his soldier escort and ran back to embrace Chado one final time, an action that brought tears to the eyes of hardened cavalry veterans who had rarely witnessed such genuine affection between supposed enemies. During the 3-day journey to Fort Apache, Sarah struggled to readjust to white society after her long immersion in Apache culture. The soldiers' casual racism and dismissive comments about Apache intelligence and humanity offended her in ways that surprised her. She had learned to see individual personalities and qualities among the Apache people, and the military's dehumanizing rhetoric felt both ignorant and cruel. When she attempted to correct some of their misconceptions, the soldiers looked at her with suspicion, as if her defense of Apache humanity marked her as somehow contaminated by her captivity experience. Emma and Thomas displayed signs of severe distress during the wagon journey, refusing to eat the military rations and crying frequently for Ishkay and their Apache friends. The children spoke to each other in Apache when they thought no one was listening, and Thomas repeatedly asked when they would be returning to the mountain settlement. Sarah realized that for her children, this rescue felt more like another kidnapping, and she struggled to explain why they could not go back to the only stable home they had known for most of a year. At Fort Apache, Sarah and her children were assigned temporary quarters in a small cabin, while military officials decided what to do with them. The fort commander, Colonel David Mitchell, was a career soldier who had spent years fighting Apache warriors, but had little experience dealing with recovered captives. He was particularly puzzled by Sarah's apparent reluctance to express gratitude for her rescue and her obvious emotional attachment to her former captors. During their initial interview, he questioned whether she had been somehow brainwashed or coerced into sympathizing with the enemy. News of Sarah's rescue spread quickly through the territorial newspapers, and she soon found herself the subject of intense public curiosity and scrutiny. Reporters arrived at the fort seeking sensational stories about Apache brutality and white women suffering in captivity. Sarah was pressured to provide accounts that would satisfy readers' expectations of savage cruelty and heroic endurance, but her actual experiences did not match these stereotypes. Her attempts to describe the complexity and humanity of Apache culture were edited out of published articles, leaving only the most dramatic and prejudicial elements of her story. The process of reintegration into white society proved far more difficult than Sarah had anticipated during her long months of captivity. Officials at the fort treated her with a mixture of pity and suspicion, unable to understand how she could have survived among the Apache without being completely brutalized. When she demonstrated skills she had learned from Ishkay, such as traditional food preparation and craft techniques, some observers questioned whether she had gone native in ways that might make her unfit for civilized society. The stigma of captivity created barriers that were almost as isolating as her original imprisonment. Emma's psychological state became a particular concern for military medical personnel who examined the family upon their arrival at the fort. The little girl had not spoken English since their rescue and showed signs of severe anxiety whenever separated from her mother. Army doctors, who had little understanding of childhood trauma, prescribed treatments that seemed to make her condition worse rather than better. Thomas adapted more quickly to the fort environment but continued to ask troubling questions about why they could not visit their Apache friends and why the soldiers spoke so hatefully about people who had been kind to them. Letters arrived from relatives in Texas who had assumed Sarah and her children were dead and had already settled the family's property and belongings. The legal complications of returning from presumed death added another layer of complexity to their situation, as Sarah discovered that she had no home to return to and no means of supporting herself and her children. The government provided minimal assistance to recovered captives, assuming that family members or charitable organizations would take responsibility for their care and rehabilitation. As weeks passed, Sarah began to understand that her ordeal was far from over. Despite her physical rescue from Apache captivity, the psychological and social challenges of reintegration would prove to be just as difficult as survival in the wilderness had been. She found herself caught between two worlds, no longer fully comfortable in white society, but forever barred from returning to the Apache community that had become her home. Her children faced similar struggles as they tried to navigate between their memories of Apache kindness and the hostile attitudes they encountered at the military fort. The fate of the Apache prisoners who had been captured during the same operation weighed heavily on Sarah's mind. She had learned from sympathetic soldiers that Ishkay and the other tribal members were being held in harsh conditions while awaiting transportation to a distant reservation. The elderly woman who had saved her life and taught her to survive was now suffering in a military stockade, and Sarah felt powerless to help the person who had shown her such kindness during the darkest period of her life. The injustice of this situation highlighted the moral complexities that recovery from captivity could never fully resolve. 5 years had passed since Sarah and her children were rescued from Apache captivity, and their lives had taken directions that no one could have predicted during those traumatic early days at Fort Apache. The small family had eventually settled in Denver, Colorado, where Sarah found work as a seamstress and her children attended public school. But the scars of their experiences remained visible in countless small ways that reminded them daily of the complex journey that had brought them to this place of relative safety and stability. Emma, now 11 years old, had eventually overcome her selective mutism, but remained a quiet and thoughtful child who seemed older than her years. She excelled in her studies and showed particular talent for languages, speaking English, Spanish, and Apache with equal fluency. Her teachers praised her intelligence and maturity, but they also noted a certain distance in her demeanor, as if she were observing their world from the perspective of an outsider who understood its rules, but did not fully embrace its values. Emma often served as a translator when Apache visitors came to Denver seeking news of family members or assistance with legal matters. Thomas had grown into a confident and capable 9-year-old who retained many of the outdoor skills he had learned during his time with the Apache. He could track animals through city parks, identify edible plants, and navigate by the stars with an accuracy that amazed his schoolmates and teachers. However, his Apache-influenced approach to conflict resolution and his casual attitude toward private property sometimes created problems in the more structured environment of white society. Sarah often found herself defending his behavior to school officials who viewed his independence and self-reliance as potentially disruptive influences. The financial struggles of rebuilding their lives had been enormous, as Sarah received no compensation for the property lost during the raid that had destroyed her Texas homestead. Government assistance for recovered captives was minimal and temporary, forcing her to rely on her own resourcefulness and the charity of sympathetic community members. She had taught herself to read and write more fluently during their time in Denver, recognizing that education would be essential for her children's future success in white society. The skills she had learned from Ishkaine proved valuable in unexpected ways. As her knowledge of traditional crafts and survival techniques attracted interest from collectors and researchers studying frontier life. Letters occasionally arrived from other former captives who had experienced similar ordeals during the Apache Wars, creating an informal network of survivors who understood the unique challenges of reintegration. Sarah corresponded regularly with Maria Santos, a Mexican woman who had been captured as a child and spent 12 years with the Apache before being returned to white society. Their exchanges provided emotional support and practical advice about raising children who had been shaped by experiences that most people could never understand or accept. The psychological impact of their captivity continued to influence every aspect of their daily lives in subtle but significant ways. Sarah found herself unable to sleep soundly unless she could hear her children breathing in nearby beds, a hypervigilance that had developed during their time in the Apache settlement, when danger could arrive without warning. She hoarded food and supplies compulsively, driven by memories of winter months when survival depended on careful conservation of every resource. Loud noises or sudden movements could trigger panic responses that transported her instantly back to the terror of those first days of captivity. Emma and Thomas both experienced recurring nightmares about being separated from their family, dreams that reflected their deep-seated fears of abandonment and displacement. The children had difficulty forming close friendships with their schoolmates, partly because they could not share the experiences that had shaped their personalities, and partly because they had learned to be cautious about trusting new people. Their bond with each other remained exceptionally strong, a result of having survived trauma together and of sharing memories that no one else in their current world could understand. As the years passed, Sarah began receiving requests from government officials, newspaper reporters, and academic researchers who wanted her to provide testimony about Apache culture and military capabilities. She struggled with these requests, recognizing that her information could be used to harm people who had shown her kindness during her darkest hours. Her refusal to participate in sensationalized accounts of her captivity frustrated many potential interviewers. But Sarah had come to understand that her story belonged to her and her children rather than to a public eager for entertainment or political justification. The fate of Ishkaine and the other Apache prisoners continued to haunt Sarah's thoughts and dreams. Through Apache visitors to Denver, she learned that the elderly woman had died during the brutal forced march to a reservation in Arizona, weakened by harsh conditions and heartbroken by separation from her homeland. This news devastated Sarah, who felt that she had somehow betrayed the woman who had saved her life by failing to advocate for better treatment of Apache prisoners. The guilt of survival while others suffered became a burden that she would carry for the rest of her life. In 1877, 5 years after their rescue, Sarah made a decision that shocked the small community that had supported their recovery. She announced that she and her children would be traveling to the Mescalero Apache Reservation in New Sea, Mexico, to visit survivors from their former captors' band and to pay respects at locations where tribal members had been buried. This journey represented a form of pilgrimage that few white people could understand. But Sarah felt compelled to acknowledge the debt of gratitude she owed to people who had protected her family during their most vulnerable period. The reunion with Apache survivors was emotionally overwhelming for the entire family. Emma and Thomas were recognized and welcomed by people who remembered them as young children, creating a sense of homecoming that was both joyful and heartbreaking. The reservation conditions were harsh and demoralizing, with inadequate food, poor housing, and strict regulations that prevented the Apache from practicing many of their traditional customs. Sarah used her savings to purchase supplies and food for families she recognized, a gesture that provided temporary relief, but could not address the systematic problems facing the confined population. During their week-long visit to the reservation, Sarah finally gained perspective on the larger historical forces that had shaped her family's experiences. She witnessed firsthand the devastating effects of government policies designed to destroy Apache culture and force assimilation into white society. Children were being separated from their families and sent to distant boarding schools, where they were forbidden to speak their native language or practice traditional customs. The proud and capable people she had known during her captivity were being systematically stripped of their identity and reduced to dependence on government, rations, and supervision. The visit also provided Sarah with a sense of closure that had been missing during her years of reintegration into white society. She was able to express her gratitude to surviving tribal members and to share memories of Ishkay that honored the elderly woman's memory. Emma and Thomas reconnected with childhood friends and participated in traditional ceremonies that reminded them of their connection to Apache culture. For the first time since their rescue, the family felt complete and at peace with the complex legacy of their captivity experience. As they prepared to return to Denver, Sarah reflected on the profound ways that her encounter with Apache culture had changed her understanding of humanity, survival, and the meaning of home. She had learned that strength could take many forms, that civilization was not synonymous with superiority, and that the bonds between people could transcend racial and cultural boundaries when tested by shared hardship. These lessons would guide her as she continued raising her children and working to build a life that honored both their past experiences and their future possibilities. The train journey back to Colorado marked the end of one chapter in their remarkable story and the beginning of another phase of adaptation and growth. Sarah had finally made peace with the contradictions and complexities of her identity as both a survivor of captivity and a beneficiary of Apache kindness. Her children would grow up with an understanding of cultural diversity and human resilience that few of their contemporaries could match, preparing them to navigate an increasingly complex world with wisdom gained through extraordinary circumstances.